Welcome to Podcasting in 3 Easy Steps with me, Juliana.
And me, Suzi. It's a show that's all about helping you create a great podcast. Are you ready to share your voice with the world but don't know where to start?
Well, you've definitely come to the right place. We understand the excitement and challenges that come with launching your own podcast.
In this show, we break down the podcasting process into 3 simple steps that will guide you from idea to a brilliant podcast your audience will love. Our mission is to make the podcasting journey accessible and enjoyable for everyone.
Together, we'll explore the ins and outs of podcasting, from crafting engaging content to finding your own unique style and also connecting with your listeners. It's our aim to empower you with the knowledge and tools you need to get going.
Because podcasting isn't just about recording, it's about building a community, making meaningful connections, and sharing your passion with the world. We're here to support you every step of the way.
So grab your headphones and get ready to begin your show.
And don't forget to hit that follow button so you never miss an episode.
In this episode, we are going back to basics and talking about names. Now, people get really hung up on naming their podcast, and it often becomes a barrier to people starting their show because I don't know what to call it. But there are some pretty straightforward tips to follow. Number 1 is, does anybody else have that name? Is it unique? Is it available? And so many people come to us and say, I've got a great name for a podcast. And we should just go and have a look on Apple, on Spotify, or search for it on the internet. Who else has that name already?
Yeah, I think that's the risk, isn't it? Kind of putting yourself in the mind of the listener is that you're the creator. You've got this amazing podcast, whatever name it is. The listener types in the name and then 15 other podcasts come up. And so that's the reason why we need to check on that availability of podcast names. And are there, 15 other podcasts that you just don't want your listener to go, oh, well, that I'll click on that one and go to somebody else's podcast. So keeping it unique, check that availability. Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, although it's getting harder and harder with the proliferation of podcasts, it is really hard to find a unique name. There are a few ways around that, which are to add your name or add a kind of a unique strapline to it rather than the main podcast name and title. Also, if there is a podcast with the same name but it's in a completely different sector, you can probably get away with that, provided it's not a sector or a podcast that's going to damage your brand or your podcast. But yeah, just search around what else is out there and try your hardest to make it unique. So, point number 2, keep it short and simple. Aim for 4 words or less. Suze, over to you.
I think this is so important, isn't it? Because when we look at the artwork for a podcast, you want to be able to see clearly what it is. And so keeping your podcast name really short and simple. If you've got, a paragraph of what it is, you're not going to be able to see that on your podcast artwork. So keeping it short and simple means it's really easy for our artwork. I would say key to this is easy to spell as well. I've met a few people along the way who have said to me, I've got this idea for a podcast, and if I'm struggling to spell it correctly, everybody else is going to be as well. So keeping it really short and simple. Again, easy to spell. Don't include the word podcast. I know this is a big thing for you, Jules.
Yeah, don't include the word podcast, because if people are listening to podcasts, they don't need to be told they're listening to a podcast. You can say it in the beginning, but you can say it in your script, but don't have it you don't need to include it in the name. I would also say it should be under the short and simple element. It should be easy to spell, as Sue says, but also easy to say. If you can't say it very easily and you trip over your words, you're going to be saying it all the time, and then you're going to be telling people about your podcast and you can't say the name of it. So say it out loud. Is it actually easy to say? And sometimes it's just the combination of 2 or 3 words together that they kind of crash into each other or trip over each other. And if you say, oh, my podcast this, and someone says, oh, what? Sorry, it's this, and they've got no idea what you're saying. Yeah, that's not great. So it's got to be pretty straightforward. And yeah, don't include the word podcast, and you don't need to include your name in the title unless you are well known and you've got a big audience already. So you can include your name in the strap line of the podcast. So you get like a subheading option on the podcast hosting platforms. So you can include a line there to include your name and just say a bit more about what the podcast is about.
Yeah, I agree. I think... Sorry, go on.
I'm hearing a little bit of jingling there. I think it's the bells and your headbands.
Oh, is it?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, it is. There's a bit of jingling going on there.
I'll try and keep still.
Coming to point 3, relevance and searchability. Get a name that works for what you're talking about. And it is the classic thing. It does what it says on the tin. It's the easiest option for a podcast name. It might make it a little bit boring, but it's better to have a boring name that says what the podcast is about or what you do and what people are going to find out in the podcast, rather than something completely obscure that nobody is going to connect to the content of the show. I'll let you add into this, then we've got a few examples.
Yeah, I totally agree, because if somebody's looking for, for example, a podcast about art and creating, you need to have that in the name. They're going to just swipe past you. Or if they type in a keyword into Apple, you want it to come up. So if they want help with small business, you want something in that title that's going to really help them to know that you're the person that they need to listen to. I think cryptic, unless you're very well known, you've got a huge amount of advertising behind you, I think it's going to be really hard to find you. So, you've got some really good examples here, Jules.
Yeah, a couple of examples. One of them is the Beef and Dairy Network. And this has been quite a successful podcast, but it is a podcast for anyone involved or interested in the production of beef and dairy herds. So it literally does what it says on the tin, the Beef and Dairy Network. Great. And then another one, a podcast I personally like, is quite old now. It came out about 4 or 5 years ago, The Missing Crypto Queen. It tells us what the podcast is about. It's about Dr. Ruja, who is the founder of OneCoin, who basically disappears when she's wanted by the authorities across the world. So again, a pretty straightforward one.
Yeah, just keep it really nice and simple. If you need inspiration, there are name generators out there that you can type in what your podcast is about and they can suggest names. And I will mention this again, ChatGPT, any kind of AI tools are really useful at this kind of thing, because it just helps bounce those ideas around and give you some inspiration. Also, talk to friends and colleagues about this. If you've got a name for a podcast that's going around in your head, say it to them and say, what do you think this is about? And just get feedback, because actually, if you're friends or family or colleagues are struggling to understand what the podcast would be about when you mention the name, then other people are going to be as well. Or say to them, I want to create a podcast about this. What do you think I should call it? And just get some ideas. It's a really good one to kind of brainstorm with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap, the key things to focus on, the 3 things to focus on when choosing a name. Does anyone else have it? Is it unique? Are the domain names or the social media handles available? Are there any podcasts already out there with the same name? Point 2, keep it short and simple. Aim for 4 words or less. Make sure it's easy to spell, easy to say. You don't need to include the word podcast or your own name in it. And then point 3, relevance to what you're talking about, and linked to that, the searchability is, if someone is searching for a podcast on a particular topic, can they find your podcast? Is the name containing those key search terms? So we will share the name generator, or a link to a name generator or 2 in the podcast show notes. And that's it for this episode. Thanks very much for listening, and join us again next week.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting in 3 Easy Steps. We hope it's helped you get started with creating your podcast.
Please share this episode with someone you think would love it. Follow so you never miss an episode, and leave us a review. Oh, and also get in touch to tell us about your podcast, and we'll share it with our listeners too. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye. See you next time.